Welcome everyone to our Public Sector Management Discussion Series. Today's event, in conversation with the Honourable Tony Abbott AC, explores the topic of public value and the future of public policy for Australia. Mr Abbott, thank you so much for helping us be here today. We're an honour for the PSMP program and QUT. We're joined by participants of the Public Sector Management Program from each jurisdiction, as well as the facilitators who are working with the cohorts in their learning journey. And my name is Catherine Batch, and together with Dr. Tony Peloso, we'll be asking the questions submitted by students completing their final subject and a graduate certificate in public sector management. A big thank you to our production team, Patricia and George, and to Mr. Abbott's staff, Charlie and Damien, who have assisted us today. In the audience today, we have Professor Victoria Browning. I would like to acknowledge the role Professor Browning plays as Director, Client Programs and Learning Innovation as she leads the academic development of the Public Sector Management Program. She is also responsible for Women in Business initiatives, including the development of Pathway to Politics program for women. Thank you, Vicky. Just a little housekeeping today. Everyone is currently muted. There's a Q&A button for audience members to use to post questions. The QUT team is monitoring the Q&A and will share with us as we go. I would now like to acknowledge the traditional owners. QUT acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nation owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We acknowledge Ngunnawal country in Canberra, where our cohort of students are located, and the Gadigal of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of Sydney, where Mr Abbott is located today. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. The Honourable Tony Abbott was elected by the Australian people in 2013 and served for 2 years as Prime Minister. He shared his notable achievements as repealing the carbon tax and mining tax, finalising free trade agreements with China, Japan and Korea, halting the people smuggling from Indonesia to Australia, becoming the second largest military contributor to the US-led campaign against the Islamic State in Iraq, commencing the biggest federally supported infrastructure program in Australian history, and as PM, he chaired the G20 meeting of global leaders in Brisbane in November 2014. In 2014 and again in 2015, he spent a week running the government from a remote Indigenous community. As opposition leader at the 2010 election, he reduced a first-term Labor government to minority status before comprehensively winning the 2013 election. Between 1996 and 2007, he was successively Parliamentary Secretary, Minister, Cabinet Minister and Leader of the House of Representatives in the Howard government.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners in all of our jurisdictions and welcome Mr Abbott. Thank you so much for being with us today. As I continue, as Health Minister, Mr Abbott expanded Medicare to include dentists, psychologists and other healthcare professionals. As Workplace Relations Minister, he boosted construction industry productivity through the establishment of a Royal Commission. As Employment Minister, he developed private sector job placement services and worked for the dole for long-term unemployed people. Mr Abbott served as the member for Warragul in the Australian Parliament between 1994 and 2019. For 21 years, from 1998, he convened the Polypedal annual bike ride, which raised nearly $7 million for organisations such as Soldier On, Carers Australia and other charities. He still does surf patrols with the Queenscliff Surf Lifesaving Club and serves as a Deputy Captain with the Davidson Rural Fire Brigade. An honour, sir, thank you. Currently, he is a Director of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization and serves on the Council for the Australian War Memorial. Importantly, in the 2020 Queen's Birthday Honours, he was appointed as a Companion of the Order of Australia for his eminent service to the people and Parliament of Australia, particularly as Prime Minister and through significant contributions to trade, border control and the Indigenous community. Now, just before I throw to Mr Abbott, I also want to welcome members of the audience, so PSMP cohorts all across the country and our PSMP facilitators. Also in the audience today, we proudly have Ms. Angela Bunny-Leach, our QUT Pro Vice Chancellor Indigenous Strategy. She sends her very best to the many cohorts in the PSM program. As Pro Vice Chancellor Indigenous Strategy, she is responsible for providing leadership in developing the strategic direction of the university regarding Indigenous matters, including institutional policy, strategy, and advice in relation to all aspects aspects of Indigenous higher education at QUT. So thank you so much for your support, Angela. I would also now like to welcome Mr. Abbott and invite him to make his opening remarks. Over to you, Mr. Abbott. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, everyone who's part of this broadcast. It's lovely to be with you. I'm currently in hotel quarantine in Sydney by virtue of having just arrived back from the United Kingdom. I'm sorry we can't do this live in a nice big lecture theatre, but this is the slightly out of joint time in which we live. Let's hope we can go back to having a relatively normal life soon. Obviously, pandemics are a problem, but just how much normal life should be constrained for them is, I think, a very vexed question. Look, this whole question of public value, let me come at it in this way by posing a couple of questions and offering a couple of thoughts. First question I want to pose is, why do people go into public life? Whether it's into Parliament, whether it's into the administration, whether it's into any entity which has a role or an influence on public life. It's easy to be sceptical about politicians. It's easy to be, I suppose, pretty sour about public servants and other officials. But in the end, no one goes into any form of public life without a strong sense of idealism and without wanting to do good. I want to make that very clear. Everyone is in it to try to do the right thing by their own lights. Now, next question I want to pose is, what do the public expect of their members of Parliament? What do the public expect of their governments? What do the public expect of officials who they're dealing with? Now, if you ask them, they'd probably scratch their heads and say, well, we want them to be honest. We want them to be authentic. We want them to be hardworking. If you're a voter of the right, you probably want them to be promoting more freedom. If you're a voter of the left, you probably want them to be promoting more fairness. Of course, there's an intimate relationship between freedom and fairness. With no freedom, there can be no fairness. And I suppose with total license, there can be no fairness either, can there? So there is a relationship between those. But in the end, regardless of your own ideological or intellectual predispositions, what people want of government at all levels is to get things done, to address practical problems. And if you ask the person in the street, what are the things that matter to him or to her, he or she will say, look, I want my cost of living to be manageable. I want my job to be secure. I want my business to be prosperous. I want my housing to be affordable. I want my community to be safe. And I want a better future for my kids. It's not all that complex. In fact, it's pretty straightforward. Now, I think that there's enormous frustration generally in Australia, but throughout the Western world with governments at this time. And the problem is not so much any moral failing on the part of politicians and officials. The problem is not that these times are uniquely difficult. The problem, I think, is that it is actually harder and harder to get things done. Harder and harder to get things done. Now, yes, in part that's because our polity is more fractious than ever. I suspect that our society is more fragmented and polarised than it was in the recent past. In part, this is because parliaments are less workable. Upper houses are much more bolshy than in the past. Our federation is much more complex and, I would say, confused than in the past. But a big feature of this is that at every level, more and more decisions have been subcontracted from elected, accountable politicians to unelected, unaccountable officials. Now, I've got to say here, given that there's quite a few officials on this call, that I have nothing but respect and admiration for the diligence and the competence and the professionalism of the Australian official class. The public servants that I've worked with over the years have all been excellent people, but I think the system is becoming more and more gummed up. Take planning, for instance, here in New South Wales. Every time there's a problem, a new body is set up. No old bodies are ever abolished, but new bodies are set up, which means that the cost and the complexity, the time and the opportunities for obstruction and lawfare and all the rest of it are just becoming almost endless. And I think this is a problem for our country, and it's a problem for our system. Now, all of these subcontracting out of decision making away from elected, accountable members of parliament and governments towards unelected, unaccountable officials are justified in terms of wanting to depoliticise the system. Take the politics out. Let the experts decide. But the trouble is, experts in their own way can be just as tunnel visioned, just as close-minded, just as biased, if you like, as politicians. And yet, the one thing you can't do with an expert is vote him or her out at the next election if you don't like what's being done. So I think this is a massive problem. I think the real democratic deficit in our country is that more and more stuff is not in the hands of elected, accountable politicians and in the hands of unelected, unaccountable officials. Now, you might say, well, this is all very well, but what's it to do with public good, the topic of this discussion? Well, as I understand the concept of public good, it's how does government in its totality contribute to the common good? It seems to me like an academic way, if I may say so, of approaching the age-old challenge: how do we do our job better? And if I may say so, one of the reasons why academic faculties of government and political science aren't perhaps taken as seriously as they should be by the practitioners of government and the practitioners of politics is because there is this tendency to make everything too academic. You may or may not find this hard to credit, but this is only the second time in 25 years or more in public life. It's 26 years now since I was first elected to Parliament. It's only the second time in all that quarter century that I've been asked by an Australian university to participate in its discussions in any way, shape or form. And you'd think, having been involved in government, in the Parliament for a quarter century, on the front bench for 20 years, in the ministry for 11 years and as Prime Minister for 2 years, you'd think I'd have something useful to contribute, wouldn't you? Anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. I just want to finish up these opening remarks by taking a real live issue and offering you a few thoughts. Now, obviously, managing the pandemic is the complete preoccupation of just about everyone in public life right now. Let's look at pandemic management in Victoria. Let's look at the policy, let's look at the practice. Well, at every point in time, we've been told by members of the Victorian government from the Premier down, that what they are doing has been done on the advice of experts. Well, it now seems that some of the experts, whether it's the Chief Health Officer or the Police Commissioner, are coming out and saying, well, actually, we didn't advise you to do this. Can I just say that politicians who want to avoid scrutiny will often take refuge in telling their audience that what they're doing is done on expert advice. It's a way of, if you like, establishing your moral authority over and above that of anyone who would pose questions. And look, in the end, my own view is that experts advise, governments decide, and you should never try to share around responsibility by attributing what you do to someone else, however eminent. Now let's look briefly at the practice. Well, there are two things that you've got to do in a pandemic if you're a state government. First of all, you've got to manage quarantine as well as you possibly can. And plainly, that wasn't done. There wasn't a lot of public good in the way that was handled. And secondly, you've got to organise testing, tracing and isolating. And while some states have managed it pretty well, after the initial Ruby Princess catastrophe, New South Wales seems to have got on top of this about as well as anyone can expect. But again, big problems in Victoria, elementary mistakes. I mean, I heard the Chief Health Officer yesterday talking about, oh, look, everything's going pretty well. We are getting to people who've tested positive within 24 hours and we're getting to their contacts within 48 hours. Well, frankly, if that's regarded as good performance, no wonder things have got so completely out of control. Test results have got to be got back quickly. People who are positive need to be contacted instantaneously. Within a couple of hours, it should be possible to at least make a very comprehensive start on contact tracing. And again, in this era of mobile phones and text messages, it ought to be possible to get hold of people well within those sorts of timeframes. And to think that 24 hours for the primary person and 48 hours for their contacts is somehow acceptable is just absurd, absolutely absurd. So again, I get back to the fundamental question: do the job properly. The best way to realise public good, in inverted commas, is for everyone in public life, from the lowest official to the highest politician, to do your job as well as possible. And look, we can have all the, if you like, nice to do things in the world, like businesses that go out and sponsor orchestras and provide money for the local footy team, and government departments with massive social inclusion programs and all the rest of it. Nice to do, but anything that detracts from getting the basic job done, in my judgment, does not advance public good at all, because it's the job that the public expect you to do. If you're a policeman, keep the streets safe. If you're a nurse, provide the best possible service to everyone who is under your care. If you're a teacher, try to inspire intellectual curiosity and ensure that those under your tutelage have the essentials to be able to make sense of whatever subject it might be. Get those basic things done, and everything else is essentially just the icing on the cake. So, Catherine and Tony, thanks very much for the chance to say a few words, and over to the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott, for that, those insights, that passion and that clarity. And a couple of things that I immediately take out, your expression of wanting to do good, and I certainly, with the experience that we have with the members of the PSMP cohorts, absolutely, we know that they show up with passion. I do love those two comments or three words that you used. I would summarize as fairness and freedom. That is a wonderful, we talk a lot about fairness. Australians are very fairness oriented. And that was a very insightful piece about fairness and freedom. And I hear very strongly you make the point about responsibility. And I think that's very important. Now, I think you're going to allow us to go off script for a moment here. The comment that you made about we're the second university in your time in senior public life, I think is very, very touching and very important. We are the university for the real world, and we do, I'll just get a little plug, we do believe, and I do want to, Catherine's deliberate passion to have people at the highest level of public service in Australia to come and address. So I think that's a credit to Catherine and also to you, sir, for accepting our invitation. Thank you.
Well, look, one of the things that ex-prime ministers can with honour do, Tony, is try to contribute to the insights and the understanding of the coming generation. So any university within reason that would like to avail itself of my insights, such as they are, would be very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we have one of our favourite questions for you right here. So thinking of your time as Prime Minister, what are you most proud of?
Okay, well look, quite apart from the fact that merely to get there is something to be proud of, given that even now in 120 years there have only been 30 people who've been Prime Minister of this wonderful country. The two things that I would be most proud of, and look, you know, it can never be about me, it's got to be about the country, otherwise you're kind of missing the point. But no one thought we could stop the illegal boat arrivals, and we did. I can remember talking to Philip Ruddock and John Howard, both of whom had been involved at the heart of stopping a smaller, earlier wave. Both of them thought the wave we faced in the middle of 2013 was really completely out of control and beyond stopping, but we did that. And in order to do so, we had to overcome a lot of official scepticism from people who had been part of failing to stop the boats under the previous government. I'm pleased to say there was one senior official out of about a dozen who remained optimistic that it could be done, and he was right, and all of the doubters and naysayers were wrong. One of the naysayers said, look, you know, you're going to upset the Indonesians. To which my response was, well, of course we're going to upset the Indonesians. Imagine if the situation was reversed and boats were coming illegally from Australia to Indonesia. I don't imagine the Indonesians would be too worried about upsetting us. Well, we have to be just as tough-minded in dealing with them as they would be on something like this in dealing with us. So look, that was something obviously that I was very proud of, and I suppose I should say before I leave this topic, I can understand why people living in rather horrible countries would like to come to Australia. And I can understand why they think that flying to Indonesia, going to the south coast of Java and paying 10 or 15,000 bucks to a people smuggler might be a good thing to do. If I was living in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iraq or Syria or somewhere like that, why wouldn't I want to come to Australia? But Australian governments have a duty to the existing people of this country to keep our borders secure. If you haven't got your borders secure, you haven't got your country secure. You are on the road to losing your sovereignty. So it's not about being anti the people who are on the boats. I can absolutely understand why they wanted to come. It's about doing the right thing by the people of Australia. Second thing I was very pleased to have been able to do was manage to respond, I think, strongly and suitably to the shooting down of MH17 by Russian-backed rebels in July of 2014. This was an absolute atrocity, As I said in the Parliament that morning, it was not a tragedy, it is a crime. And crime cannot go unacknowledged, and as far as possible, it should never go unpunished. Now, we did our best to hold the Russian government to account, and by being very, very firm, we got those Australians, we got their remains back and back for their families, and I think it could easily have turned out even worse had we not been able to respond very strongly as an Australian government. Again, I can remember sitting in the National Security Committee of the Cabinet, which sat very long and very regularly through that time. And a couple of times the officials were, how do we say, I think they were inclined to think there was nothing that could be done. I can remember saying, so what would if there were 40 Americans dead in this plane, what would be happening now? One of them said, well, the 82nd Airborne would be on its way. And I said, well, okay, we haven't quite got the 82nd Airborne, but we can't just accept that this has happened and there's nothing that we can do. Because if you do accept that there's nothing that can be done, you are essentially saying to bullies, well, the field is yours, and no self-respecting country can allow that to be the case.
Okay.
So very powerful, thank you. So I'm going to pass to Catherine now. I do just want to say my father emigrated from Italy after World War II, and he thought he'd won the lottery every single day. So I'll thank you for those comments.
And I'm sure he's very proud of you as well, Tony.
Thank you.
So we might just sort of shift. We've got some questions from the PSMP group, and one of them was, and it's quite connected to your last comment, so in times of crises, how should policymakers go about decision making to ensure that citizens are supported and the Commonwealth is preserved? And I think that's quite connected to the example you've had with the US obviously deploying action as a result. I mean, how would you comment to that question?
Well, the first thing you've got to do is you have got to size up the situation as best you can, and having made the best assessment you can of the peril, having considered as best you can the upsides and the downsides of any action, you've got to do what you think is best at that time. But one thing you've always got to do is, with an unfolding situation, is respond intelligently to things as they develop. And let's just take the pandemic, for instance. Now, when we had the reports out of China in late January, early February of something really, really catastrophic happening in Wuhan, and then come the beginning of March, when we started to get the footage out of northern Italy of hospitals in meltdown and bodies in corridors and so on, I think it was understandable and reasonable for governments to lock down. I think it was all understandable and reasonable. I think it was also fairly obvious by early April that this wasn't the Black Death. It probably wasn't even the Spanish flu. And my own judgment is that a few weeks of lockdown would have been necessary in order for us to get our hospitals prepared, in order to get our quarantining systems perfected, in order to sort out testing, tracing and isolating systems. And I think at that point, we should have, with, taking the public into your confidence, I mean, telling the public what you're thinking, outlining the problem as you see it, outlining the threat as you see it, both to lives and to livelihoods, and then explaining why you were doing things. I think we should have taken a rather more liberal approach than we did. It's interesting, if you go back to the expert recommendations of dealing with pandemics prior to this actual outbreak, lockdowns and border closures played almost no part in it. And I wonder if the thing had first become apparent anywhere other than Wuhan, in a highly autocratic, indeed totalitarian country, whether we would have adopted lockdowns quite as swiftly and quite as comprehensively as we did.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll just now pass to Tony.
So, Mr. Abbott, the roles of many of our global public policy organisations are being questioned and reframed. Yeah. Would you care to comment on this? And in particular, are there any organisations or frameworks that you'd like to focus on?
Look, I'm generally in favour of international bodies, because all of the international bodies were essentially set up in the aftermath of World War II, and they reflect the ethos, the Anglo-American ethos, the, I suppose, liberal mindset which inspired the principal victors of that horrible cataclysm. So we are still, in this sense, living in a post-war world. Now, global bodies, which back then might have had 20 or 30 members, now have almost 200 members. And quite a few of the members don't share that liberal, pluralist, democratic mindset which animated the Anglo-American victors of the Second World War. Nevertheless, I think it's important that countries like Australia participate very vigorously in these organisations to defend and protect, and where necessary, and where possible, extend that liberal, pluralist, democratic mindset. But we've always got to do it on the basis of a very clear conception of our values and, dare I say it, our own national interest. I'm not in favour of going into these global bodies seeking soggy compromises. I'm in favour of going into these bodies trying to build coalitions for good values and good outcomes. That's what I'm in favour of. Now, I think that Australia was obviously extremely successful going into the World Health Organization recently with a proposal for an independent, thorough investigation into the origins of the pandemic. Self-evidently sensible. In the end, even the Chinese felt they couldn't oppose it, although they've been taking it out on us ever since. So look, we need to make the most of global bodies, but we need to do so from a position of confidence, not from a position of, oh, look, you know, we just want to go with the flow, and whatever you guys think is a good idea, we'll fit in with.
Well, this question follows perfectly on from that. So what is Australia's role going forward in terms of shaping global thinking? And what do you think should be Australia's key initiative on the global stage?
Okay, that's a very fair point, and I dare say I'm expected to say doing more on climate change or something like that. Look, I think we do best on the global stage when we come to a particular issue or a particular entity with some standing. And interestingly, Australia is the country which has best managed a wave of illegal would-be migration by sea Other countries are still wrestling with this. The Europeans obviously have still got a huge problem with boats coming across the Mediterranean. The British now have a huge problem with rubber duckies going across the English Channel. So I think that's an issue that we can speak with some authority on, some credibility on. And look, the fundamental point is that no one country is obliged to be a lifeboat for the world. Every country has a right, and I would argue a duty, to keep its character, and uncontrolled immigration, notwithstanding the fact that the would-be migrants claim to be asylum seekers, as I've said often enough, and yes, copped some criticism for, it amounts to a peaceful invasion if it happens in sufficient numbers. And once it starts, these things tend to grow and grow and grow. So I think making it crystal clear in all world bodies that sovereign governments have a right to control their own borders. Sovereign governments are under no obligation to accept everyone who wants to come. There is a world of difference between people who cross a border to escape dreadful persecution and people having crossed one border in order to be safe, then decide they'd rather be prosperous and cross several more borders. I mean, once they've crossed another border beyond the point of first refuge, they cease to be refugees in any meaningful sense, and they become would-be economic migrants, and countries have no obligation to accept people under those circumstances.
Thank you. So now, what advice do you have for our PSMP cohort members about how good ideas can be heard by people in power?
Well, people in power tend to have wax in their ears from time to time, as you know. Look, okay, let's suppose I'm a junior officer in a department and I have some ideas as to how things might be done better. If there is not a process for taking it up the line, that would be a real pity, and any entity that doesn't have a process for taking it up the line needs to develop one. And frankly, any entity where the senior management don't actually come down to the front line and talk to staff who are actually doing the hard work, that's a problem as well. So look, I think what you should try to do is have an open relationship with your immediate superiors. I know personalities can intrude, and look, not all of us get on fantastically well with everyone else, and some people are more receptive, some people are less receptive. You don't want to make a pest of yourself. I accept all of that, but in the end, nothing is ever going to improve unless someone tries to make it better. And why shouldn't that someone be you? Now, if you knock your head against a brick wall again and again, fair enough. Maybe you've just got to accept that there's no more you can do on this particular subject or in this particular context. But please never assume that there's nothing you can do. As I often say to people, effort doesn't guarantee success, but lack of effort guarantees failure. And if you see something that shouldn't be happening and you don't do anything or say anything, you become part of the problem, not part of the potential solution. You, in effect, you own responsibility for that. And if it's something that you think is substandard, that's no good.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott. Thank you. Catherine?
I've got a good lead-on question now from the group. Basically, does lobbying work in your opinion?
Well, I suppose it depends what you mean by lobbying. I mean, all of us, in a sense, are lobbyists. Every time we talk to someone else and suggest something. We're a lobbyist in the broad sense of that word. And look, the world goes around because billions of people have trillions of interactions, and as a result of those interactions, more often than not, better things happen. My life is better because of the interactions I have with others. I'd like to think other people's lives are better because of the interactions I have with them. So in that sense, of course, lobbying works. If we're talking about formal lobbying, where business A pays 10 or 20 grand a month to lobbyist B, and lobbyist B then goes along and tries to persuade politician C to do something differently, does it work? I think it depends on two things. It depends upon the nature of the relationship between the person lobbying and the person being lobbied. And it depends on the quality of the argument that's put forward. And I suppose it also depends upon the general environment in which the lobbying is taking place and the priorities of the organisation which is being lobbied. So does it work? I suppose it must help, otherwise people wouldn't keep paying large amounts of money to lobbyists. Should it help? Well, look, I'm not against lobbying, but I think it's important that lobbyists adhere to standards of ethics and honour. And just like a barrister who shouldn't advance in court an argument that he knows to be false, a barrister is obliged by professional ethics, as I understand it, to only argue something which is justifiable in law. I think lobbyists are obliged to look at the downsides as well as the upsides of their client's case, and not to overstate it to those they're lobbying. And frankly, if you think that someone's case is if you know that someone's case is worthless, you shouldn't take it on just for the money. I can remember years and years ago, long before I ever went into Parliament, I was asked to join a lobbying firm, and I said no, because I took the view that if something was worth doing, you should be prepared to do it for free. And if something wasn't worth doing, all the money in the world shouldn't persuade you to do it.
Oh, we've got another way of us three asking the same question. Did the opposition contesting your policy ever make you rethink your direction?
Look, you usually only come up with a policy if you think it's the right one. So you've usually thought through the arguments before you adopt something. And once you've adopted something because you think it makes sense under the circumstances, unless the circumstances change dramatically, it does take a lot to make you change. There are a couple of issues where my position has changed over the years. I was never in favour of a paid parental leave scheme, and talking to my colleagues who were both mothers of young children and professional people, particularly members of Parliament and ministers in government, it gradually dawned on me that if we wanted professional women to have families, we had to make it easier for them to be both mothers and professional women. And just as childcare is an important part of that, I thought paid parental leave was an important part of that. So I did change my mind there. I'm still not a huge fan of multiculturalism, but I'm much more relaxed, if you like. I think that the multicultural nature of modern Australia is a great asset today, whereas I didn't think that 20 or 30 years ago, perhaps 30 years ago. And I suppose there the insight was talking to people from very diverse ethnic backgrounds who had come to make Australia their home, not because they wanted to change us, but because they wanted to join us. And it suddenly dawned on me that the migrants who chose this country, as opposed to those who were born here, in a sense were the most Australian of everyone, because they'd made a conscious decision to embrace this place in a way that the people who were born here had not necessarily. So look, they were two rather important issues on which my position changed over the years. Something a little different, but in some ways no less significant, and I don't claim to have been unique in this, but I think all of us have got a rather different view of China now than we had maybe 5 years ago. 5 years ago, most of us thought that China was liberalising and was essentially on a path of convergence with the Western liberal democracies. Obviously, it would always be, Confucian, and it would always be, it would have sort of liberalism with Chinese characteristics, so to speak. But I thought we all thought that China was on that path. It's pretty obvious that if it ever was, it sure ain't now. But I don't regard that dawning insight as anything particularly unique or special, because it seems that most people in public life have got it.
Thank you. And I think this question lets us circle back to the I suppose, the public value component. So what's more important, public value or staying in power?
Well, doing the right thing is obviously the most important thing. I mean, if you're not prepared to lose, you're not prepared to fight. And if you're not prepared to fight, there's nothing worth being in office for anyway. So look, governments have got to do what they think is right. I mean, one of the reasons why I have been a consistent skeptic of climate change policies that cause massive economic dislocation is because I think that sometimes you've got to be truthful with the public. Just because the public thinks that, in the case of the Extinction Rebellion mob, if we don't drastically decarbonise immediately, the world will end in 12 years' time. Just because a significant section of the population, maybe even a majority, think that, is no reason to go along with it if you are convinced that the facts don't bear out the course of conduct that they want. So look, I think sensible politicians have got to pick their fights. You can't argue over everything endlessly, but you're not here just to stay in office, just to win elections. You're here to win elections with good policies, and you're here to stay in office by being a good government, not just one which tries to conciliate and appease every pressure group.
So over to you, Tony.
Thanks, Catherine. So here are a couple of slightly differently phrased questions from some of the members of our cohort. So, and this is written in the first person. So the question goes, I'm wondering about how we help people within the public service, within the public service itself, to understand what public value is. The second part is, how can we promote the why of what we do and its value internally in order to help them then promote that externally?
Well, again, I would refrain from using phrases like public value. Look, I know people build academic careers around these sorts of things, and trying to find intellectual and academic frameworks into which things fit. Look, I understand that, and fair enough, conceptualizing can help us to understand things better. I accept that, but in the end, if you're a public servant, it's about doing your job. So if, for argument's sake, your job is monitoring compliance with Medicare rules, for argument's sake, let's pluck something out of the air. You do your job well if you talk routinely to the doctors who are trying to comply with the Medicare rules, understand what's going through their head, and where you think there might be a problem, rather than throwing the book at them, sort of say, look, this is what I think, you tell me what you think, and let's see if we can come to a reasonable understanding. Now, if you do that well, you're adding value. That's providing public value, I would have thought. But if you're just there to sort of rubber stamp something without applying intelligence, well, what's the point? And if you are in a position of some public authority, or if you are working for government and you think what you're doing is pointless, well, say to the immediate superior, why are we doing this? Do we really need to do this? And do things better.
Thank you.
I mean, here's one. Every time we go into the country, we've got to fill out a form. Every time we come back, we fill out a customs form. Does anyone ever look at them? I mean, you know, they just get tossed into a box after the Border Force person looks at them. I mean, every time I've come back into the country in recent times, the Border Force person has said anything to declare. And if it's nothing, there's no further action. And if it's, oh, look, you know, I've got an extra bottle of booze, or I think I bought more than $1,000 worth of gifts that I'm bringing back, they normally say, oh, how much extra booze, how much extra gifts? And if it's maybe 2 extra bottles or $500 worth of extra gifts, they say, oh, fair enough, away you go. And I mean, what happens to those forms? If those forms if nothing happens to them, why do we bother?
Well, Mr. Abbott, I hope there's no one waiting for you as you exit. No, I'm going to throw you. I'm going to throw you a couple of let's call them lovely softball questions. So part of it is for me.
They're the hardest. A lot of great batsmen get out to full tosses, don't they?
Yeah.
That's a great point. So we're in the business of education, and I didn't read out that you are also a Rhodes Scholar. So first thing, I'm curious about the impact that education had on you. And the second thing is someone on our panel has said to you, where do you find the energy to do all the things you have accomplished? So combine those two in any way that you wish.
Well, look, I was incredibly lucky to get the chance to go to Oxford, and I learned some wonderful lessons for life there. I confess that I didn't take my studies as seriously as I should have when I was at Sydney University. I was so pleased to get out of school and get to university. I was sick of being at school. I wanted to be a kind of adult, and you can be a kind of adult at university. And the last thing I wanted to do was sit in lectures and be hosed down with stuff which you could very easily just get out of the textbook at your own time and in your own way. So I spent most of my time at Sydney University playing rugby, socialising, getting involved in student politics. I've got to say that big lecture format was not very conducive to a deep intellectual engagement. That started to change in my final year at Sydney University, when I was lucky enough to have Professor Alice Tay, the late great Professor Alice Tay, as my jurisprudence professor. And that course was mostly taught in small tutorials, and that made a huge difference. And I think I did finally start to grasp what a university education was all about. Then I was lucky enough to go to Oxford. And initially, I would read everything that the tutor told me to read, and I would put together these pathetic essays that were just collages of quotations. And apart from the fact that I sensed that this wasn't really what was expected of me, the dismay of my tutors was palpable. And at some point, after a couple of months, the penny dropped that I was supposed to read these bloody things, assimilate them, and then address the topic in my own way and in my own words. And once I discovered that, I so enjoyed my time at university, and it was wonderful preparation for everything I've done subsequently as a journalist, as an advocate, as a member of parliament. Look at the facts, get the opinions, assimilate it as far as you can, then make of it what you will, come to your own conclusions, make your own decisions, and then go for it. Now, as for all these extracurricular things, well, you know, I can remember I joined the local fire brigade because we live on the bush, and I didn't think that I could realistically ask other people to defend my neighbourhood if I wasn't prepared to do my own bit for it as well. And I can remember after my first fire call, it so happened I was doing my first duty crew with the Davidson Brigade on a Sunday. We got a fire call, and we probably only get 40 calls a year, so it was quite I suppose serendipitous, if you like, that we got a fire call on this day. Funnily enough, my first cabinet meeting was the following day. I'd just been promoted to cabinet, and the skipper turned around to me and he said, "So all you guys right for an overnight deployment?" And I thought to myself, geez, that means I'm going to be late for the cabinet meeting the next day. What do I do? And I thought, well, if I say, "Sorry, fellas, I've got a cabinet meeting to go to next day," these guys will never take me seriously again. So I took a few deep breaths, rang my office and said, "You're going to have to put in an apology for me to that meeting." I got there about midday, smelling like a barbecue, and one of my colleagues said to me, "Oh, what kept you?" And I said, "Oh, I got a call out with the local brigade." And the colleague said, "Oh, Tony, you're a cabinet minister now." And, occasionally the words come to you. Often they don't, but they did on this occasion. I said to her, "You've got to be a human being before you can be a cabinet minister." Now, I see these extracurricular things, in inverted commas, as part of being a human being living in my part of Sydney.
I think we're almost at time, but I was just going to say, so what's next for Tony Abbott?
Good question. And look, there's not a lot that an ex-Prime Minister can honourably do, because you're overqualified for almost any job, and you've got to be careful about slipping into the role of all care and no responsibility commentator on your successes. So look, from time to time, I will have things to say about public issues. I made a speech in London last week about pandemic policy, which I've been, in a sense, wanting to say for months, but I thought it was important to wait for the right context in which to say it. So look, from time to time, I'll have things to say. I've made a few speeches on China recently, because I think this is a very important issue, and it goes beyond sort of commentary from the cheap seats on the events of the day. I'll keep serving in the local brigade. I'll keep doing surf patrol. I'll serve on the War Memorial Council and the Ramsay Centre Board. I've recently picked up this unpaid advisory job for the British Board of Trade. That's important, A, because it's in Australia's interest as much as it is in Britain's, that Britain flourish in a post-Brexit world. So I'll throw myself into that, but and just see what happens. I've had a wonderful life. I hope to keep contributing, and I'll do my best to make the most of whatever opportunities come along.
We hope to add get QUT guest lectures to your list.
Well, Mr. Abbott, thank you so very much. That is absolutely wonderful, and we appreciate your precious time. And to commemorate this lecture, a donation has been made to the QUT Learning Potential Fund. From tackling student poverty to giving students the opportunity to pursue career paths they've never dreamed of, QUT's award-winning Learning Potential Fund has been making a tangible difference to student lives for over 20 years. And I'll throw to Catherine to wrap up today.
Okay, so thank you everyone for their participation today. We hope to see you again soon, and a very big thank you to Mr. Abbott for his time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.